Welcome back, 5th graders. We're on Domain 3, still on poetry. Today's lesson is Lesson 6, number 359. Our objectives for the lesson is to summarize a poem's overall message and analyze how the use of figurative language affects a poem's meaning, and to create similes and metaphors describing the movements of animals. Some key vocabulary that we're going to discuss is cautious, which is careful, convenient, nearby, or easy to find. Dew are drops of water that form overnight. An oar is a long, thin, usually wooden pole with a blade at one end used to row or steer a boat. Plash is a splash. A seam is the place where two things connect. A quatrain is a 4-line stanza. And a slant rhyme is when two words share only the same final consonant sound, so crumb and home. So today we're going to read about a poem by Emily Dickinson. The poem's called Number 359. So this lesson asks you to use many of the poetry reading tools we've already learned to explore her poems. Dickinson, who lived from 1830 to 1886, is now considered one of America's most important poets. Since she did not share her writing with many people during her lifetime, she became well known after her death. Some of the people who did read Dickinson's poems during her lifetime noticed they appeared to be somewhat different from other poems. And as you read, you should pay attention to how they seem different than the other poems we've been reading. But before we get into that, let's read her biography. Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts on December 10, 1830, to a wealthy and successful family. She attended school for only a short time, but was a prolific writer who composed nearly 1,800 poems during her lifetime. After leaving school, Dickinson spent the majority of her life in seclusion from the other people. She maintained many friendships, however, by writing letters. Dickinson's poems touch upon many themes, including death, nature, the Bible, and the human mind and spirit. She is best known for her non-traditional use of syntax and style, but she remained an unknown and mostly unpublished writer during her lifetime. Her family discovered her poetry journals after she died in 1886. Her first book of poems was published in 1890, although her work only gained widespread appreciation later in the 20th century. Today, she is considered one of America's most important poets. So this is Emily Dickinson's number 359. I'll give you guys a few seconds to read through it. Feel free to pause the video and read it as many times as you need. So let's discuss to understand this poem. So the title is a number, which is already an unusual part of her poem. She actually rarely titled her poems, because remember, her poems weren't identified until after she had passed, so she didn't really title them, so most of the time they were just identified through that. So most contemporary scholars reference her poems by number. The numbering system reflects the poem's chronology, which means how when they were basically published, so they go in a timeline order. So she actually didn't title them, so this is the only way that they were able to identify these poems was through a certain number, which is already very unusual because most poets actually do title their poems. It also uses irregular capitalizations. So scholars have shown that Dickinson's own textbooks recommend using capitals to emphasize particular words, which was a common practice in her era. So you probably noticed that there were some unusual words that were uppercase or capitalized. That was totally normal during that time. It was just to show that that was an important word. The poem contains numerous dashes. This practice is also common in the 19th century writing, although Dickinson perhaps used it more distinctively than others. So what that means is she used a lot of dashes. That was very common back then, but she used it more so. Okay, I think I accidentally doubled up on some of the stuff. So the next part is the second and fourth lines in each stanza rhyme. So the rhyme scheme for the first two stanzas is A, B, C, B, and D, E, F, E. So we talked about that in the last lesson. The rhyme scheme is the pattern of which you identify the repetitive words. So this is the pattern you would see in those first two stanzas. This is a very unusual rhyme scheme. Usually it doesn't follow that. So when a poet starts a pattern such as a rhyme scheme and then breaks or changes that pattern, often that change reveals things about the poem's meaning. So she definitely broke off from that pattern through the rest of the poem. So it shows that the poem actually shifted in meaning a little bit. So she uses a lot of figurative language. So reviewing figurative language is when we're talking about similes and metaphors. And similes or metaphors are to compare things. Similes use like or as, and metaphors are just comparing two things. So she used it to describe the actions of these animals. So you're going to try to pick pairs of words that seem to go together from anywhere. It doesn't have to be from a chart, but you're going to try and see if you can figure out a pair of words that go together. And you're going to write a simile, use the word like or as to connect this animal action to something else. So for example, if you had the word flap and bird, you might write the bird's wings flapped like oars dividing the ocean. That's an example of a simile because it uses the word like inside of it. Then what you're going to do is you're going to turn that simile into a metaphor. You're going to actually take that like out and change it. So instead of writing like or as, you're just going to say the bird's flapping wings were oars dividing the air. So it's not changing it too much. It's almost just taking away that like or as. So your assessment is to come up with an animal action that you would enjoy, any animal action, and you're going to try and compare it to something else in a simile version and a metaphor version. So that is your actual assessment for the end of this lesson. And we will see everyone in our next lesson.